Mr. Krabs is the definition of a love-to-hate character. While he's one of the most iconic and beloved characters in SpongeBob, he's done his fair share of nasty deeds. But while he's not the most generous crab in the sea, he's certainly not all bad. This is Mr. Krabs' deeds, good to evil.
That sounds like me money drop.
These here be the good deeds. The first deed is his first purchase. While we know Mr. Krabs as the cheapest crab in the deep blue sea, he wasn't always that way. Having grown up in poverty, he was first introduced to money at a carnival in his childhood with his best friend at the time, Plankton. His first ever penny would open his lifelong lust for money, but at this moment, he uses it to buy a balloon for Plankton. It's a minor deed, but it's such a stark contrast to the all-consuming greed that Mr. Krabs would possess later in life. It's really sweet, but it's a shame these two weren't friends longer. Next is Mr. Krabs helped SpongeBob regain his confidence. One of the missed aspects of Mr. Krabs' character in the early seasons of SpongeBob is his relationship to SpongeBob. They had a sort of father-son-esque bond portrayed in many episodes, especially throughout Season 1. In the episode Pickles, SpongeBob loses confidence in his cooking skills after being tricked into thinking he messed up Bubble Bass's order.
The pickles should be right where they always are.
In response, Mr. Krabs comes to his house and sits with him for days, waiting for him to recall how to properly make a Krabby Patty on his own. While yeah, Mr. Krabs did this in part to start making money again, the fact that he sat with SpongeBob for a long time shows that he did care for his employees' well-being. High school proms are a big deal. Oh, okay, not really. But Mr. Krabs finding Pearl a prom date was. Mr. Krabs may be cheap, but he also loves his daughter. In The Chaperone, when Pearl's prom date stands her up, he does everything he can to find her a new one.
No, baby, no more crying. We'll get you a date.
He asks all the customers in his restaurant, offers to go with her himself, and ultimately offers his employees to go with her. This results in SpongeBob and Pearl doing the sponge and having a great time at the prom. He might not be the best person, but Mr. Krabs, honestly, isn't a bad dad. He loves Pearl, and while he does spoil her, his determination to protect her and her happiness is evident in moments like these. Now we have Employee Brotherhood Day. This is easy to overlook, but it's a rare example of Mr. Krabs showing care for his employees. That's right, we said employees, as in plural. It's no secret that Mr. Krabs cares for SpongeBob, but Squidward, that's a rare treat. In Dying for Pie, it's revealed that Mr. Krabs has a mandatory policy for his employees to give each other gifts on Employee Brotherhood Day.
After you present your brotherhood gift.
This isn't done for profit, or out of some strange bikini bottom legality. It seems to be a well-intentioned activity for employee morale. When Squidward and Krabs believe SpongeBob has eaten an explosive pie, Mr. Krabs encourages Squidward to make what they believe to be his final hours a fun time. It's touching to know that Mr. Krabs at least cares about his employees' happiness, even if his greed makes that easy to forget. While Mr. Krabs has changed over the years, he certainly has his moments in the later seasons too, like teaching SpongeBob to drive. When SpongeBob fails his driver's test again, shocking, I know, Mr. Krabs offers to give him some driving lessons when his sadness starts to affect his work. The reason we mention this is his determination and patience in regards to teaching SpongeBob. Despite all the damage done repeatedly to the Krusty Krab by SpongeBob's reckless driving, resulting in a lot of expensive repair bills, he continues to teach SpongeBob to the best of his ability.
Oh, broken wall. That's about 15,000.
Remarkably, he doesn't even lose his patience, which again is incredible considering the amount of money he had to spend on repairs. Next, we have Mr. Krabs' relationship with Mrs. Puff. In the episode Krusty Love, Mr. Krabs falls in love with Mrs. Puff at first sight. He wrestles with the concept of spending ludicrous amounts of money on Mrs. Puff, believing that it's the only way to stay with her. Thankfully, Mrs. Puff pitches the idea of going Dutch, and this seems to have been successful, as the Season 10 episode, Whirly Brains, it's revealed that they're still dating.
Mrs. Puff, we've been dating for 16 years now, so...
It took many years for the series to acknowledge that their relationship was still a thing, but hey, they seem happy together. Saving the Krusty Krab from Carl and Howard Blandley was not only hilarious satire on mega corporations, it was also a pretty cool move. When Mr. Krabs sells the Krusty Krab to a larger corporation, he enjoys the excessive wealth and freedom he has. until he gets bored. Upon coming back to work at the Krusty Krab, he's outraged by the brainwashing of his employees and the fake processed patties that have replaced SpongeBob's lovingly cooked masterpieces.
That's because they don't know what they're eating.
So he totally wrecks the Krabby Mondays. Yeah, that's what they called it. Upon having it utterly destroyed, buys it back at full price. He was willing to give up his newfound wealth to restore the integrity of his restaurant and give the people of Bikini Bottom real food. It's still kinda driven by money, but he's got some dignity, and you gotta respect that. Next is saving the Bikini Bottom Mint from a robbery. Mr. Krabs' love of money took him and his daughter to the Bikini Bottom Mint on vacation. While this was admittedly a little selfish of him, he definitely redeemed himself by the end of the episode. When the mint is robbed by two criminals who plan to take care of the tourist, Mr. Krabs jumps in the line of fire to fight them off, with SpongeBob's help, of course. Though he may be greedy, Mr. Krabs is willing to protect the innocent when the need arises, and he didn't even ask for a reward beyond a couple of bucks, which is incredibly noble by his standards. Mr. Krabs stealing food for Pearl was surprisingly touching. In the episode Growth Spurt, Pearl is going through, you guessed it, a growth spurt. Being a whale, that means she needs a lot of food. With the house cleaned out and all the stores in Bikini Bottom being closed, Mr. Krabs has to steal food from all over Bikini Bottom. Well, yeah, it's basically a crime spree. If you look at the context, this is a clear example that, at the end of the day, Mr. Krabs will do anything for his daughter. And even if it involves crimes, loving your kids is never a bad deed. Though, robbery is, so it is dropped a few spots. Protecting the formula from plankton is one of Mr. Krabs' most frequent good deeds, and the example we're going to give today is in the episode Fun, where Plankton manipulates SpongeBob by befriending him to gain his trust and steal a Krabby Patty. Of course, Mr. Krabs sees this for the load of barnacles that it is, but sweet naive SpongeBob wants to believe that Plankton has turned over a new leaf. By following them to a theater, Mr. Krabs is able to expose Plankton as a liar and also makes him smash himself into a concrete wall as a bonus. This is only one of many moments where Krabs outwits Plankton, but we think it's one of the best examples of his intention to protect not only the formula, but to protect his employee from unnecessary heartbreak. Finishing off the category, we have warning Bikini Bottom about the hooks. When a range of fishing hooks land in Bikini Bottom, Mr. Krabs frantically warns the Krusty Krab patrons. He shows concern for SpongeBob, clearly illustrating his fatherly side.
What did I tell you about those hooks, boy?
When he finds out that Patrick has peer-pressured SpongeBob into playing on the hooks, Mr. Krabs reinforces the rule, even going as far as to have Squidward lure him onto a hook, believing that he'd been caught for a moment. It's like a scared straight moment, but Mr. Krabs came up with a plan to make sure SpongeBob would never play on the hooks again. Considering the fact that, for sea creatures, being caught on one of those hooks would lead to fates worse than death, Mr. Krabs' attempts to protect SpongeBob and the rest of Bikini Bottom from them has to be his most good deed. Unfortunately, these claws ain't just for doing good. We've explored Mr. Krabs' good side, but now it's time to get into the bad deed. Forgetting Pearl's 16th birthday was a more minor occurrence, but still one of the relatively few times Mr. Krabs fell flat as a loving father. He ruins all of Pearl's birthdays with his incredible cheapness, and this isn't a case of a struggling dad trying his best, but an incredibly wealthy man avoiding any dollar he doesn't have to spend. Despite Pearl's pleading, Mr. Krabs plans Pearl's party, using the absolute cheapest resources at his disposal. From using stale popcorn instead of popcorn, dishwater instead of punch, and worst of all, Squidward instead of Boys Who Cry, Mr. Krabs would have ruined Pearl's 16th birthday had it not been for the happy little accident of giving SpongeBob his credit card. He got lucky, but his cheapness stuck out pretty bad. Don't worry, it gets worse. Up next is his attempt to sabotage SpongeBob. Fun fact, Mr. Krabs was technically the first SpongeBob antagonist. In the pilot episode, he sabotaged SpongeBob's application to the Krusty Krab by sending him on a wild goose chase for a spatula he didn't believe to exist.
We'll never see that lubber again.
In his defense, he at least wasn't directly harming anyone, just listening to Squidward's advice not to hire him, but it's still mean. Thankfully, he would end up hiring and befriending SpongeBob, so surely this is the last time we'll see him mistreating the poor guy, right? Well, next is the time he betrayed SpongeBob and company in the sled race. The Frozen Face-Off special was a dangerous adventure for SpongeBob and company, but the important thing was that the friends had each other, or maybe not. Mr. Krabs abandoned the group to cross the finish line alone and claim the cash prize for himself. Again, he wasn't directly hurting anyone, but he showed here that he'd rather leave his friends behind than even share his cash prize with them. Now we have using SpongeBob and Squidward as live bait. When Mr. Krabs loses his $1,000,000 to a giant clam, he goes off the deep end. Like Davy Jones's locker deep. This culminates in him using SpongeBob and Squidward as bait to lure the clam to their fishing boat so he can regain his dollar.
Live bait.
This should, under normal circumstances, be much higher on the list, but that being said, we wanted to give Mr. Krabs a bit of leeway for two reasons. First and foremost, it was very clear that Mr. Krabs had lost his marbles by this point, and secondly, he didn't actually intend to let SpongeBob and Squidward be eaten, jumping at the clam as soon as it jumped up to chomp them. It was still a risky and selfish thing to do, and the worst case scenario would have resulted in the pair hanging there forever. But if nothing else, as bad as this was, we can at least say that Krabs wasn't quite himself here. And circling back to the mistreatment of SpongeBob is the shopping list. From the episode Shopping List. In this episode, Mr. Krabs sends SpongeBob and Sandy on a hunt for the ingredients to the Krabby Patty. This leads to them, SpongeBob especially, being endangered constantly, having close encounters with fang-toothed fish, yeti crabs, and even the Flying Dutchman. Upon their return, however, Mr. Krabs reveals that the shopping list was a wild goose chase meant to keep Plankton occupied, while Mr. Krabs ordered the real ingredients from the bargain mart.
I couldn't afford to have Plankton following me while I was getting the real ingredients at the bargain mart.
We get the real plan, but dude, why not make the wild goose chase less dangerous? While he didn't mean any direct harm, Mr. Krabs put SpongeBob in harm's way when it very easily could have been avoided. In all honesty, he deserved the Texas whipping he got from Sandy. Now we have his workers' rights violations. It's no secret that Mr. Krabs isn't the best boss in the world, but the more attention you pay to details, the more clear it is that it goes much deeper than expected. Here are just a few examples. In Squid on Strike, he tries to charge his employees for lollygagging, breathing, and even existing. In Big Pink Loser, SpongeBob reveals that he had to pay Mr. Krabs $100 an hour to work for him at first.
When I started working here, I had to pay Mr. Krabs $100 an hour.
In Bummer Vacation, Mr. Krabs not only forces SpongeBob to go on mandatory vacation, because he'd be fine if he went any longer without one, but when he earns a bonus of 1/4, SpongeBob claims it's more than he makes in a year. These are just a few examples, but you get the idea. In the real world, Mr. Krabs would be arrested in seconds. Now it's time for one of his most infamous deeds, selling SpongeBob's soul to the Flying Dutchman. It might be shocking that this isn't higher, but hear us out. In Born Again Krabs, the Flying Dutchman gives Mr. Krabs a chance to redeem himself for his greed after a near-death experience. When he falls back into his greedy ways, the Dutchman gives him an ultimatum to either save SpongeBob from being taken to Davy Jones's locker or take all the money in his pocket.
That depends. How much money are we talking about?
Naturally, Mr. Krab chooses the latter, a lofty sum of 62 cents. This is so vile that even Squidward, who blatantly dislikes SpongeBob, calls him out on it. This would be much higher were it not for Krabs' immediate remorse, throwing the money to the ground and crying for SpongeBob, who thankfully annoyed the Dutchman enough to bring him back. It was still awful, but at least he went back on it. Next is he killed the health inspector. Okay, not really, but he came pretty darn close. When he suspects that the health inspector visiting the Krusty Krab is actually a scam artist trying to get free food, he purposefully makes the most disgusting Krabby Patty possible, forcing SpongeBob to help him. When the inspector passes out, they believe he's dead, and subsequently try to cover their tracks and hide it from the police.
Now get digging!
Easily one of the darkest episodes in the whole series, and at the end, he even tries to blame the whole ordeal on SpongeBob. To his credit, he never meant to actually kill the guy, and he did believe him to be a scammer, but there were definitely better ways to handle that whole situation. Next is trying to steal Plankton's customer. In Plankton's Regular, Plankton finally has a customer who enjoys his food. Upon realizing this, Mr. Krabs goes ballistic and goes out of his way to steal his only customer.
You gotta get that guy back on our side.
Yeah, his only customer. What makes this act so despicable is that this wasn't a matter of Mr. Krabs protecting his formula from Plankton. It was just Mr. Krabs going out of his way to bully Plankton. It's mean and unnecessary. Don't get too comfortable though. The relationship between them gets a lot worse. Now we have Mr. Krabs turning SpongeBob and Patrick into wrestlers. When the grand prize for defeating 2 champion wrestlers is announced announced at $1 million, Mr. Krabs jumps at the opportunity until he sees how strong they are. Naturally, he tricks SpongeBob and Patrick into going into the ring instead, convincing them that it's only pretend wrestling.
What? Those two? They're harmless.
SpongeBob and Patrick thankfully win by luck and the power of iron buns, but Mr. Krabs gravely endangered their lives. At least he didn't end up getting the cash prize. But hey, cheer up Krabs, you still get to go to wrestle camp. Animal abuse is a nasty crime, and abusing jellyfish is no different. In the episode Jellyfish Hunter, Mr. Krabs discovers that the Krusty Krab's customers love SpongeBob's new creation of Krabby Patties with jellyfish jelly. He not only forces SpongeBob to catch all the jellyfish in jellyfish fields, but he then puts them in a factory to mass-produce jelly.
I'm gonna need more than that, boy!
This causes them great pain and exhaustion, and would have continued to do so had SpongeBob not set them free. And the worst part is that this isn't even the only instance of animal abuse under his belt. In The Scent of Money, he also abuses Gary. In this episode, Gary has eaten a magnet and gained the ability to attract coins to his shell. Mr. Krabs takes advantage of this by using him as a metal detector. Despite knowing this causes Gary pain, he goes above and beyond to abuse this newfound talent. We think that this is even worse than his abuse of the jellyfish population, because in this case, he's not just abusing wild animals, he's abusing the beloved pet of his trusted employee. Not to downplay the former, but the latter sticks out even sorer. The next moment is pretty greedy, firing SpongeBob for a nickel. Remember the episode Welcome to the Chum Bucket? The one with that tear-jerking musical number about Mr. Krabs would rather trade everything in the Krusty Krab away to get SpongeBob back? Well, the special episode, SpongeBob You're Fired, did not. Mr. Krabs discovers he can save one nickel by firing SpongeBob. Not only is this the dumbest decision Krabs has ever made, considering SpongeBob is the main reason the Krusty Krab is beloved, but it's also a heartbreaking betrayal of their bond. SpongeBob might just be Mr. Krabs' most trustworthy associate, so to cast him aside over a nickel, a single nickel, goes beyond ruthless, even by his standards. He only hires SpongeBob back, not out of remorse, but because, surprise, the Krusty Krab falls into chaos after he's gone. Poor SpongeBob. Should have just gone back to selling pretty patties at this point. Mutiny on the Krusty is next. Yeah, we're giving a whole spot to a full-on episode of the show. Mr. Krabs is a pretty typical tyrant, refusing to pay his employees, forcing customers to spend all their money in his restaurant, etc. When a rip current takes the Krusty Krab into the air, he's blown out after being stuck in a barrel, and when he comes back, he's basically a stubborn child. His worst deed has to be his refusal to save the restaurant from a giant monster threatening to eat it, unless the customers all agree to make him their captain and spend all their money there.
But you gotta promise to spend all of your money right here.
What's more, he only even compromised this far when SpongeBob threatened to spend his first dime, truly a fate worse than death. But if nothing else, he did save them at least, and he did show appreciation towards SpongeBob for believing in him. It's also at least a little understandable that he's stubborn, considering the customers let him fly out into the rip current. Credit where it's due, I guess. Still, the best we can say is that the deeds below it are worse. He also tried to frame SpongeBob, again. While maybe not quite as cheap as firing him over a nickel, this episode was an even more grave betrayal on Krabs' part. In Patty Caper, Mr. Krabs tasked SpongeBob with finding the secret formula, having been stolen from the heavy security team that ships it to the Krusty Krab. This turns out to be a scam, however, with the ultimate goal being to frame SpongeBob for stealing it. It turns out that Krabs himself stole the formula. Much worse than this, he was willing to allow his most valuable and trusted employee to not only believe it was his fault, but to let him go to prison, or maybe even worse, all so he can avoid paying a shipping fee. This has to be the most awful thing Mr. Krabs has done to SpongeBob. So surely you would believe us when we say that he sinks even lower for Squidward, right? The runner-up for most evil deed goes to his attempts to murder Squidward. Yeah, this really happened. Don't believe us? Check out the episode Out of the Picture. In this episode, Mr. Krabs learns from an art appraiser that art becomes exponentially more valuable once the artist has passed away. He subsequently sends Squidward on a series of dangerous quests to get him out of the picture. This starts out as the usual employee endangerment. Krabs was merely trying to get Squidward away from the restaurant for a long time, so he could trick the appraiser into thinking the art was worth much more. But when Squidward continually returns from these dangerous orders too quickly for Krabs' scheme to work, he starts trying to murder Squidward. There's no other way to spin this. It's not endangerment anymore. It's a showcase of Krabs having devolved into a total psychopath, blatantly aiming to kill his own employee for money. It's hard to imagine a kid's cartoon character getting much worse than that. But here's one particular scene that goes beyond. The gold medal of evil goes to Mr. Krabs' deed of psychologically torturing Plankton. Plankton and Mr. Krabs' rivalry is certainly bitter, that's no secret, but the episode one-course meal takes us way too far. After another one of Plankton's attempts to steal the Krabby Patty formula is thwarted due to being scared off by Pearl due to a chronic fear of whales, Mr. Krabs starts to dress up as her to torment Plankton. Mind you, this isn't a case of Mr. Krabs trying to keep Plankton away from the Krusty Krab and his formula, he's just going out of his way to terrify him, and takes pleasure in Plankton's terrible anxiety and paranoia. This ultimately results in Plankton laying out in the street, waiting for a bus to run him over. Upon being informed of this by SpongeBob, Krabs just laughs.
He's a mess.
What was once a close friendship turned bitter rivalry devolves into a sadist torturing his opponent to the point of self-termination, and he has no sympathy or remorse. This episode had us feeling for Plankton, the main villain of the series, and honestly, sometimes it makes us wonder if he can even be considered the worst of the two. But whatever way you slice it, there's no doubt that this is the furthest Krabs has ever been from his greedy yet fatherly self. We couldn't possibly put anything else at the top.